Hi everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Now today, I'm honoured to be speaking with Dr Natalie Campbell. Natalie, welcome to the Sports Psych Show.
Thank you for having me.
Thrilled to have you on. Why don't we get cracking by you introduce yourself to the Sports Psych Show audience?
Yeah, so as you kindly said, my name is Dr Natalie Campbell. I work in a couple of different areas. I'm currently a senior lecturer at the University of Gloucestershire. I work in the Department of Sport and Exercise Sciences, but I guess by qualification I'm more of a social psychologist. That's what my PhD was in, as opposed to a hardcore sports psych. I am an associate of a charity called Switch the Play Foundation, and we help to transition athletes outside of their sporting life, predominantly athletes that are low funding, have their funding cut, but all of the guys that are on, the lower tiers, as it were. And I do quite a bit of corporate consultancy, just in the areas of how to help work not suck as much as it does for some people, I guess. So those are kind of like the three main areas I move in.
Interesting. And we've spent a bit of time off air thinking about what are we going to talk about today, because there's, your description of what you do, there's so many little things that we can talk about on the Sports Psych Show, and we're definitely going to have to get you on at some point and talk about performance lifestyle management, because that's so relevant to our audience. But we've decided to talk about pop psychology and cutting through pop psychological BS. And I'm not saying those two words because this is a clean podcast. So when we say BS, I think everybody knows what that refers to, but we won't say that term. And we want to work together to just talk about common cliches and maybe try to debunk a few. It's an area I'm fascinated in, Natalie, and I know you're interested and engaged too. What brought you to an interest in pop psychology and what's true, what's not true, how consultants, how coaches should conduct themselves around this kind of these psychological terms?
That's a great place to start. And I think as an academic, it's kind of drummed into you, evidence. You always need to kind of look for evidence. But I spent 10 years in practice as a teacher, as a PE teacher, and before sort of moving into academia. And for me, experience, storytelling, all of my work is qualitative. It's sort of really central and important. So I know there is a need for evidence, and that should, and that I say the word, should in quotation marks, drive a lot of what we do, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't pay attention to when people are giving voice to their experience. And if I think about sort of when all this started, it was about 12 months ago, and as I've just mentioned to you before we started, I've just had a baby, so I've got a little 10-month-old, and anyone who's listening who has spent a lot of time just sat on the sofa with a newborn that doesn't do very much. I spent a lot of time being on LinkedIn and Twitter, more than I would normally. And I think it was because of the amount of time that I was spending on those platforms, my mind just sort of tuned into stuff that I hadn't necessarily thought of before, or stuff that I might have scrolled because I wasn't necessarily looking for it. And I remembered sort of two rather distinct posts that made me think, oh, that's really interesting. And I'll come to those posts in a second, but it was more from my own selfish point of view of I was thinking, right, I'm going to be out of the game for the next 12 months, right? I'm on maternity leave. I don't want to miss some of the important stuff that's happening. So I was kind of purposely looking for stuff that, I might be missing out on. And I saw these two posts came. And one of them was someone had put up, it takes 90 days to make a habit, 9 days to break a habit. And I was like, okay, that's interesting. And I get the idea of it, but I was interested in the numbers. I was like, I've never heard those particular numbers. And then someone else had put, oh, if you work with male athletes, you most likely need to work on your soft skills. And if you work with female athletes, you most likely need to work on your hard skills. And immediately I was like, I find these concepts interesting. And so I just tweeted back at the people that posted them, and I was like, hey, this is really cool. Can you please put me to the direction of the paper that you've used, or like the evidence for this? Because I'd really like to use this material, you know, in my lectures or stuff when I get back. And sort of from that, I started to, whenever I saw something, I would just politely, and I would politely ask, oh, can you just put me to the evidence for that? Is there a paper? Because it means that you've done the hard work for me, really, which is quite helpful. And it kind of led to people not engaging in the conversation back with me. Sometimes I would get blocked, and all I'd done was, ask for the evidence. I was like, oh, I hope I'm not being too rude.
Criminal behaviour, Natalie.
And it just sort of, and it got me thinking, oh, hold on, am I actually, what I'm framing, politely asking for some guidance on what these people are putting out there, I think it was sort of being framed more as I was holding people to account of what they were putting out. And, some of these people had thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands of followers. And so I thought, well, there must be some legitimacy to what they're putting out there. These are really decorated psychologists. And I don't know whether it was just they were too busy to give me the evidence, which is most likely the case. But so that's where it started for me. I started tuning in more to not just taking for granted what people were putting on their social media posts, and asking for some evidence and to engage in conversation. And really that's how you and I started our conversations, of just having a mutual interest in, maybe we should start holding people account to the BS that they're putting out there, and let's just question that a little bit.
You mentioned a word, experiential. And when I think of, having been a sports psych for 15 years, I think experiential evidence is important. And I'd like you to come back at me, Lee, and sort of critique what I'm saying. I think for me, coaches start, I'm talking about coaches here, coaches start in that experiential zone, or at least in my opinion. By experiential, I mean experiences and interactions. That how we were coached is ordinarily how we then go and coach in the coaching world, and then we'll interact with our peers and we'll build our knowledge. But then we've got the empirical side of things. And I think a lot of coaches stick to that experiential side of things, and they don't necessarily go off and read papers. So they don't join up experiential with empirical. And I'm not saying they should or they shouldn't, but that's what I found, is that coaches tend to stick to that experiential. What's your thoughts on that balance between experiential and empirical?
I mean, I think that is a really interesting topic, and sort of over the years, and you've probably seen people write about it, talk about it. I'm saying it myself, like being a pracademic, so someone that kind of like bridges the gap between being a practitioner and an academic. And I like the way you dropped in saying, in my opinion, I think if we're looking at a hierarchy of knowledge, if we were to go with like the hardcore sciences, the positive sciences, then they would say, okay, well, in terms of the hierarchy of knowledge, you've got opinion, then you've got experience, and then you've got evidence. And, evidence is the gold standard. We want our randomized control trials. We want our P to be less than 0.05. We want our confidence levels, blah, blah, blah. But then, and this is where the sociologist in me comes in, and with the philosophical stuff that you need to read around that. John Locke, one of the most famous English philosophers, says you can't know what you don't experience. So if you can read as many papers as you want about what it means to be marginalized, what it means to be a male coach in a female world, having that experience and that experiential knowledge is something that the data and the numbers can't bring to life, you know? So I think if you've got coaches that are mindful enough to have a foot in both camps, then that's going to do wonders for their reflective practice. And the different philosophies that they're bringing into their coaching, yes, opinion, experience, evidence, but that middle layer of experience, you've got to start with the case studies. You've got to start with the story. My PhD was all about storytelling, and my best friend, who's a biomechanist, we were doing our PhDs at the same time, and she literally could not understand how I was getting a PhD from asking people to tell me their story. She was like, "Oh, but where's your evidence?" And I'm like, "Well, their words are their evidence." And I have fun having those conversations with the hard scientists about how words and experiences are evidence too.
I agree with you. So what I'm hearing you say is that when you look at a tweet such as, it takes 90 days to make a habit, 9 days to break a habit, and you pose the question, well, where's your evidence? It might not just be from empirical evidence. It might not just be from the research papers. You're also asking, well, great, fine, fantastic. Do you have an overwhelm of experience then that suggests on that 91st day that the habit is going to be great? That's what you're posing.
Yeah, and I think what was really interesting, so I didn't get a response back from the person that tweeted that, but I got a response from someone who had recently been at a talk that person was at. And that chap said, "Oh, well, I think what the psychologist was referring to was that it takes longer to make a habit than it does to break it, and that circumstance is different for everyone." And I was like, well, that's cool. If he'd have said that, it takes longer to make a habit than to break a habit. Yes, there's loads of empirical evidence and there's loads of experiential evidence that we could look at to be like, okay, that's cool. But I was interested in the numbers, because I was thinking, okay, well, if we're going for professional integrity here, to me that's a statistic. I can't just take that and put it in my lectures, or I can't design an intervention for individuals with those exact numbers if there's nothing to support it. So I was more kind of annoyed at just the arbitrariness of just plucking these numbers. I assumed they were just plucked from thin air, because I can't find any evidence that is exactly 90 days to make it, 9 days to break it. And for me, that's very different than putting a tweet out saying, just remember, if you started something at the moment and you're struggling with it, it takes longer to make the habit than it does to break it, so stick with it. To me, they're two very different concepts to be putting out in the professional world.
I've written 3 things down here: all or nothing, black and white, and assumptions. And regular listeners of the Sports Psych Show will recognise all or nothing and black and white as thoughts spoken about in terms of rational emotive behaviour therapy. But I almost wonder if those can be attributed to these types of tweets or these types of pop psych comments. This is sort of black and white thinking, all or nothing thinking, enormous assumptions.
Yeah, and I said, being in the qualitative world, I work with all kinds of shades of grey. I'm very much a fan of that colour, and I think a really good example that's coming around at the moment, and I think I mentioned to you that this is sort of one of the BS areas that I wanted to talk about, is sort of the notion of authenticity. That word, not even at the moment, I'd say for the last 5 years, we are authenticated out. All props to Brene Brown for pushing this to the forefront of everybody's lexicon. And it's, there is so much that is right with it that it's almost that you don't want to sort of pick it apart. And again, whilst this is on LinkedIn, and I was kind of scrolling through, and this next bit that I'm going to talk about. I'd seen all this stuff about authenticity coming up all the time, and I'm not smart enough to figure out why is this annoying me. Like, I couldn't put my finger on it, but I was like, this is annoying me, but I need to think about why. And I wasn't smart enough to come up with the solution. And I was listening to a podcast by a guy called Adam Grant, and he's an occupational psychologist. He's just fab. I really enjoy Adam. And one of the podcasts was about authenticity. And he was talking about, yes, people need the freedom to be themselves, and all of his stuff is within a work setting. But he was like, okay, well, there are three main issues with this constant, persistent be yourself that is, floating around in our world at the moment. And I can go into it in detail if I want to. Like, please put the link to like Adam's podcast down. But he basically said, like, authenticity without boundaries is careless. So he's like, yes, authenticity is about emotional vulnerability. And he's like, but that only works if you've already proven your competence. So if you have a brand new coach into a system, and the first thing they do is say, hey, I'm being authentic, I haven't prepared a single thing for us to do, off you go. People would be like, who the hell is this person? Like, you're unprofessional. How much to learn from someone who has no idea, what they're doing? But if Pep Guardiola comes over and says, hey, I know this is my first session with you, but I've not prepared anything. I want to see what happens. Off you go. People are like, oh yeah, he's just being authentic. He's being his authentic self. That's really cool. He's showing us how human he is. And so for me, that tip number one, authenticity without boundaries, is careless. When you go to your networking events, your true self might be, I like to spend most of my evenings just hanging out in my underwear. All right, that might be your authentic self, but that's not what you're going to lead with when you're at like a business networking event.
It's a bold move if you lead with that sentence.
Exactly. And then tip number two for his authenticity, he's like, authenticity without empathy is selfish. And he's sort of saying, authenticity can't exist in a vacuum. You have to consider others. And it's something, and I won't apologize for this, I love Love Island, and I really love following the sociological like output that comes after like a Love Island episode. For me, it's just fascinating about all the little different like microcosms of society and how they interpret all the different things that happen. My husband thinks I'm bonkers, but I find it absolutely fascinating. And any of your listeners that do watch Love Island, they'll know that probably over the last 2 years, the catchphrase is, I'm just being true to myself. If I be true to myself, then everything's okay. I'm being true to myself. I'm being true to myself. And you see people behaving in ways that are so disrespectful and so impolite to other people. But saying I'm being my authentic self is not an excuse for treating somebody inappropriately. And it's really important to be true to your values. Yes, of course it is, but it's really important that you take the time to listen and understand and respect the values of others. It can't just be all about me. The authenticity that comes with your practice has to be, I value me, but I value you just as much. Does that make sense?
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
Again, this is not me. This is all Adam. He came up with those sort of three tips, but I was trying to think, okay, well, how do I take those three things and sort of work them into my world and what I like doing. And he also, so the third one he then says is like, authenticity without status and trust is risky. And he talks about how, if we look at, so psychopaths have just this one inadaptable personality, right? They are very fixed in how they are. But the authenticity that sort of comes with your own self, being able to self-monitor, to have that kind of like higher levels of self-monitoring, and having the courage and the compassion to sort of try different selves, different authenticities, depending on the company that you keep. So I'm a completely different person in front of my students to how I am in front of my friends, to how I am in front of my child, to how I am in front of my parents, And so having different selves and different versions of yourself doesn't make you phony. And I think sometimes people are really quick to call people out on, oh, you're not being your authentic self because you weren't like this yesterday. Well, no, it wasn't like this yesterday because we were in a board meeting and we were discussing this particular topic. But I'm like this now because I'm with my friends and I'm in a safe space, So, and I think for me, what that speaks to is, if we've got this, the notion of treat others how you would want to be treated. And Adam kind of says, well, no, actually, if we're being our authentic self and we're acting with empathy and we're able to flex who we're with and the environments that we're in, actually we want to treat others how they want to be treated. And so that might be where this flex of self and different authenticities of self come in. If you are authentically someone that likes to be quite softly spoken, you like to sugarcoat things, you like to avoid conflict, that might be your authentic self, but it's okay when you find yourself in an environment that requires control and directness and conflict. It's okay to bring that self out. It doesn't make you fake or phony. So that once I'd listened to that podcast, that sort of really tuned me into all of the bits and pieces that I saw coming up about, bring your authentic self to work, bring your authentic self to everything you do. And the advice is, well, actually, spend a bit of time reflecting on what that authentic self is and just figure out which parts are best for which situations.
Wow, where do I start? I mean, this is very meaningful to me because, I had an interesting debate with somebody who was doing some work in this area and was talking about the importance of authenticity, and I just, having played, let's go on a sporting basis here, having played pro sport as a professional golfer, I certainly didn't want to be authentic. That was my problem, is I was authentic. I was damn nervous on the first tee. I looked around and thought everybody was better than me. So often they weren't, actually, but some of the times they weren't. And that damaged me. It didn't help my self-efficacy, my self-belief. Now, I needed to be inauthentic. I needed to be inauthentic at that moment. I needed to stand myself and hold myself and present myself assertively, with power, with confidence. Being authentic killed my golfing career. As you can hear from my tone, I feel quite strongly about this. Of course, there's probably a time. The three things I hear you say there: context matters. That comes back to Adam Grant's first one. I think context matters. Yeah, authenticity without boundaries is careless, so context matters. I think the second thing, I translated that as who is in front of you matters. Who is in front of you matters. We can't just be low agreeable all the time if we're quite a low agreeable person, because we're just going to be shouting at people all the time, and we're just going to be speaking straightforward to people all the time, and not everybody wants to hear that. That doesn't help anybody or everybody. And then I think the third one, I kind of heard know your role. Know your role. Being authentic, status and trust is risky. So it really, really, really resonates with me.
Yeah, and I just think, and because it's such a broad topic. And there is place for dissonance. So what you were just saying there about you needed to be inauthentic within the golfing world. So like if you're going to a job interview and people are like, just be yourself. sometimes the best advice you can have is be less like yourself. But learning to be less like yourself is where we've got space for growth. And I think that's where Adam's thoughts come in, is just because you change and flex, as you said, depending on context and company, doesn't make you fake, and it doesn't make you phony. But it's just having that bit of clarity of knowing that being 100% yourself 100% of the time can be risky, can be unprofessional, can be damaging to others. And it's just, so I said, one of the BF moments. When you see those little mantras of authenticity, just pause and be like, yes, but, yes, and, yes, if.
It's really interesting, Natalie, because you've helped me catch myself there, because I just think this cuts quite deep for me, having I think not achieved what I wanted to achieve in my sport of golf, and largely because I'm a real student now of personality science, and I know that personality science doesn't resonate with a lot of psychologists, but I think actually having a broad idea of the structure of personality, say from the 5-factor model, and when I reflect back, my neuroticism walking onto the first tee, my high agreeableness didn't help. I think at times I was too high conscientious during practice. All kinds of different subtleties and nuances to my personality, and I'm introducing personality characteristics because I almost wonder if we take high functioning individuals, and we take this notion of high functioning individuals manage themselves and manage their conversations with others in a flexible manner, depending on where they are, who they're in front of. Knowing their role in the capacity they're in at that moment. That to me is high functioning individual. I think psychology in many respects is there to help people develop flexibility of characteristics in the environments that they find themselves in. I have to be a different person in my training environment as compared to my competitive environment. I might have to be a different person in front of my coaching staff or my manager as compared to my teammates. I have to flex my characteristics, and ultimately I find that's what I'm, as a practitioner, as a psychologist, I'm striving to help players do.
Definitely. I mean, adaptability is such a strong skill, and it is a skill. And we've talked quite a lot about personality science, and it's something that I'm very, very interested in. And I think people that are listening to show that have worked in elite sport, or maybe not, I'm making an assumption there and I shouldn't do that, but if you've ever worked in an environment where they've used a psychometric profiling tool, and you get given this 20 paper on who you are, I think there's two caveats with that. One, it provides people with a nice get out of, well, this is the science that says who I am, so don't try and change me. And you're like, oh no, like we just need to work with that tool a little bit more to better understand it. The sidebar, the tools have a fantastic place, but they need to be used appropriately, otherwise all hell can break loose with them. But looking at from all the profiles that have been done with myself for the different aspects for Ocean, I fall in the middle. They say, you know what, for some reason, and I don't know how or why, I'm very good at flexing. I'm sort of a bit of an adaptive chameleon, which at times has been quite damaging for me, because it means that I can present as being inauthentic because there's no authentic me. Does that make sense? And where, especially if I keep company that see me in different environments, colleagues that are colleagues but are also very good friends, they are the ones that know the values stay the same, but my behaviors can change significantly. And so I think there is there is a slight danger, but I think if you're aware of it and you understand how to work with yourself with it, then it's okay to have these different authenticities.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a few other topics that we want to talk about. One of which is fear of other people's opinions.
Yeah, so I mean, the topics that I've picked were sort of things I went back through my Twitter timeline and I was like, oh, okay, who put us that seem to speak to me? And it's only now that I can say, speak that at the time, being deeply sleep deprived, I was just ranting my passive aggressiveness on both timelines, which I probably shouldn't have been doing. But again, someone had put up just the post of like FOPO. It was something like don't succumb to FOPO, fear of other people's opinions. And that I don't know why that got me thinking, but it did. And for me, that kind of got me thinking about, well, okay, the word fear, other mantras in psychology that get thrown around, the only thing we fear is fear itself, feel the fear and do it anyway, be fearless, all these contradicting bits and bobs that are out there. And first of all, I thought, okay, well, if I don't fear my students' opinions of me, when they're doing their end of module evaluations, I don't fear it, but I definitely need to take their opinions into consideration. If I just walked around with well, I don't care about your opinion, I think I gave the best lecture ever. If you think it was terrible, that's your problem, not mine. I mean, I can't work in my profession like that, And then I was, well, what about other people's professions where the opinions of others very, very much matters? Like medicine, what if you're an oncologist and someone is like, well, I think the way that you handle your bedside manner for your palliative care patients is crap, and the oncologist is just like, well, I don't care. I don't care what you think. Your opinion means nothing to me. Salespeople can't just fear other people's opinions. Politicians can't fear other people's opinions. And so you'd think, if we're looking at sports coaches or, people that are working with athletes, not saying, as I say, you shouldn't fear the opinions of other people, but that doesn't just give you an outright writ to say and do whatever you want, whenever you want. It can't just be all me. And I think a great example of someone who does not fear other people's opinions is Donald Trump, right? So imagine if we had a whole world of people just being like, I don't fear your opinion. I think it, and this is almost like the next step of like the self and knowing when to flex. When is it important to not be fearful of sticking your head above the parapet? So if I'm talking about like serious issues in sport, like doping, like abuse, like harassment, how do you work with individuals to make them feel confident and competent enough to not fear the opinions of others and potentially the consequences of those opinions when there is some kind of immoral injustice? I think that is very different to not fearing someone's opinions when you're telling them that they put on loads of weight over lockdown. I think there's a difference, and there's a need to be aware of individuals, and I'll go back to Donald Trump just because he is a fantastic example of someone that is so low self-monitoring. Like their scale of self-monitoring is so low that if you never changed your behavior based on context and company, as we just discussed, just imagine what the world would be like. And so like it goes back to what we were saying in terms of just putting out very simplistic. No, that's the wrong word. There's nothing wrong with taking something very complex and making it simplistic. the issue for me is when someone takes something very complex and makes it very reductionist. And there's a big difference there for me between something being simple and something being reductionist. I think and depending on when your listeners are listening to this, a good example of when someone has stepped up to know that they might be fearful of other people's opinion, going to say it anyway. If you to value what you stand by. So if you are saying, okay, no, don't be fearful of other people's opinions, to me that means you've very much got to be an ally to the people that do that. So if you've got an individual that is in a meeting and they say something that is ignorant or unfounded or upsetting, you can't on one hand be, oh, don't fear other people's opinions, say what you want, and then someone does say what they want, and then you talk about them behind their back saying, well, that was a stupid thing to say. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. What's the difference between simple and reductionist? What do you mean by that?
So I think for me, having something that is simple is being a way, it's having a way to demonstrate that you understand all of the ifs and the buts and the ands and the it depends, and you can still communicate the message in a way that demonstrates that. Whereas the reductionist is just, would take the complexity and just wrap it up in something that is very singular. And a way that I might think about it sort of sociologically is quite a lot of these statements are trying to access the individual, but the individualism is missing. The individualism of the circumstances for that person, to take that bit of information and apply it to their life. Sometimes people will put out these BS statements and they're from a very privileged standpoint. They ignore, and I think that this will sort of feed on to like the third BS gripe that I have. They ignore that some of the things that are being put out are really difficult for people to action. And it just seems really easy. Oh, don't like the way things are happening? Oh, just change your mindset. So changing your mindset is it's like saying to an alcoholic, oh, just don't drink. I think that's one of the easiest ways of being able to say, if we've got an alcoholic, a sick message is having alcohol is really dangerous for your physical and your mental health. Let's help you do something about it. The reductionist is just stop drinking. I don't know if that's a suitable analogy.
It's a great analogy. What's that third bugbear of yours?
So, the third bugbear for me is when people put out little snippets of what makes people successful. So successful people get up at 5 a.m. Successful people don't complain. Successful people prep their meals all day, every day. And it's just, because they're missing who is it that is defining the success, and what does the success look like for that person? So to just put a blanket statement out there of successful people get up at 5 a.m., that is reductionist. And it's like, well, I'm getting up at 5 a.m. to go and sort out my 10-month-old. But, does that mean that I'm being successful? Well, if my version of success is making sure that my child's fed, then yes, I'm being successful. But if someone in the corporate world is saying, well, make sure you're hitting the gym at 5 a.m. to be your best self, it's just these habits of successful people. It's making sure that, as we said, going back to the start, that the complexity of it isn't missed, that the company of who it's aimed at. And I think this is where my sociologist voice comes out. A lot of these aspects successful people do this, successful people do that, tends to come from the privileged, white, heteronormative, cisgender male who more than likely doesn't have any caring responsibility. So it is really easy to get up at 5 a.m. and hit the gym. It is really easy to prep your meals all day. It is really easy to carve out 90 minutes a day for yourself for meditation. But if you've got children to take care of, if you've got parents to take care of, if you've got siblings to take care of, I think for me, these little mantras of successful people do this completely miss the understanding of how the definition of success needs to be completely unique and individualistic. So I don't think it's helpful. So if you're talking with your athletes, successful athletes don't complain. That's really patronizing, and it's also really dismissive. It's sort of it's saying that there is something wrong with someone voicing about how they feel. Like if an athlete is complaining that they don't like the color of the kit, sure, that might not be something we complain about. But if an athlete is complaining that there's no faith room for them, that's a complaint we need to listen to.
I agree, and I would also say that the notion of high performing athletes don't complain is simply untrue. In fact, I would say some of the best in the world complain a lot. It feels like this stripping back of complexity towards overly simple ideas, overly simple notions, actually prevents us from building a picture, a landscape of how people can become successful. That success isn't this linear pathway, that success isn't done in only one way, that success, whatever, as you're pointing out, whatever success looks like for somebody, we are all individually different, and we will all reach our success, whatever that looks like, in our own individual way. And when we strip things back to a degree where it's overly stripped back and we just have these one sentence tips for success, then actually we cloud the picture of truth, essentially. Truth in inverted commas. We cloud the picture of how somebody gets to where they want to go to, because there's multiple ways probably of getting to where you want to go.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one of the things we want to be careful of not doing when we post these tips, when people post these tips, is engendering unwanted feelings in individuals. So tips like that they can bring about feelings of guilt. They can bring about feelings of failure. They can bring about feelings of unaccomplishment that individual might not have had for that day, but they see it by someone, that they might think is a role model, or someone within the industry that has lots of followers, or, and they might have felt that for that day, it's only midday, but they've managed to take a lot of stuff, and whatever they've done, they've managed to do really well so far. And then they see this thing that says successful people do this, and their immediate thought is, well, I haven't done that. And they might just take that on the chin and pay it no regard. But there's other people that will take that and think, oh my God, I'm so far away from where I want to be. All this does is remind me how far back down the queue I am. And like I said, I think for me, one of the issues with these books of highly successful people, 9 times out of 10, they are written by cisgender, heteronormative, white privileged men, where, it's really easy to become CEO of somewhere if your dad was CEO of the company before,
What I'm hearing you say is that, firstly, let's define what success looks like, because success is going to be different for different people. Secondly, I'm hearing and I'm thinking that the pathway to success is multivariate and individual specific. And actually the skill for coaches is probably creating a negotiation and a co-creation with the person or people in front of them around individual difference and around multivariate approaches. Because I think historically in sport we've been very socialized into this is the way to do it. It's the grind, it's the hardship. As you said, it's getting up at 5 a.m, it's watching tape all night, it's it's sweat, it's this and it's that. And I think of the conversation, a Sports Psych Show episode that I had with Elliot Newell, who's based at the English Institute of Sport, and the approach they're taking, which is a much more subtle and nuanced approach to, look, we've got these individuals. Everybody is an individual. There are multiple ways for them to succeed, depending on what that success looks like for them. Now, how do we facilitate that process? It's as far away from have to do this, you have to do that. They've stripped away the shoulds and the musts and brought in the maybes and the possibles and the cans, and let's experiment. And every day is a sort of a me experiment towards helping somebody, facilitating a process of helping them get towards the picture they've got in their mind of what they might want.
Yeah, very much so. And I think sort of encapsulating all of that is the word acknowledgement. You know, acknowledge that success looks different for different people. And if you've got, you know, successful people don't surround themselves with toxic people, you know, just cut toxic people out of your life. Well, for some people that's very difficult to do. Let's acknowledge that. You know, what if your boss is the toxic person, and you might have people say, oh, well, just leave your work. Well, you know what, I can't just I've got bills to pay, I've got money to support, I can't just leave the toxic person. So I think there's more to be done in terms of helping people find ways to cope in situations where they can't just leave, or they can't just put that person out. You know, maybe the success comes from engendering these skills that help you build bridges with these toxic people, help you to form a relationship that isn't as damaging. It's not as easy as successful people don't surround themselves with negativity. Well, that's pretty impossible, you know. And understanding that, I saw, what did I see the other day? There was one that was, that's it. The 2 easiest ways to determine success comes down to how you spend your time and who you spend it with. If you're self-employed and you have nobody else in your life, and you have the literal freedom to do that, God bless you, like, phenomenal. But to just state that as the easiest way to succeed comes down to how you spend your time and who you spend it with. For me, that's quite a damaging statement, because that is what then engenders it. It sort of allows people to look around at their life and be like, oh my God, look at my situation. And they might have been perfectly happy with their situation before, but it might lead them to really resent the fact that they have to care for their sibling, or really resent the fact that they have to care for a parent, or really resent the fact that, you know, they have to spend time doing something that doesn't automatically equate to their success. For me, that's quite damaging in terms of saying that's the easiest way for people to achieve success. Because what if you want to spend your whole time hanging out with Manchester City? Well, you can't. You can't just say, oh, you know, I played for Division 3, but I want to be successful. So the easiest way for me to succeed is to go and surround myself with Man City players. Sorry, as far as I know, you can't do that. So
it's looking at what's possible for you within your social structure. And as you're saying, I mean, I'm thinking that, I mean, how bad do you make people feel by saying, well, you've got to strip away these people from your life, that's the only way you're going to be successful? Again, whatever that success looks like, that's just untrue. There must be countless examples of people who have achieved whatever they want to achieve, whatever that looks like. They've achieved it with all kinds of influences in their life. Some of them who have people around them who might be from the outside, it looks like they're negative influences, but actually they're not. They're influences who can be burdensome some of the time, for want of a less crass term, but also give great joy and great comfort to people. It's just,
exactly.
Again, we're coming to this word complexity, and before we get on to the fourth one, do you feel that these mini messages, these reductionist messages, stem from the fact that as human beings, we find complexity exhausting? It almost feels like, I suppose, right, I want to help somebody be successful, so I've got to tell them this message here. I was going to say simple, but it might be a reductionist message, okay? I'm going to tell them this, and that's going to be really useful for them. Whereas if we add maybes and possibles, if we add complexity into the mix, we feel we're not being helpful, or we feel that we're confusing them. Is it that people feel complexity creates confusion? People feel that complexity is exhausting?
Yeah, I give the benefit of the doubt that when these things are being put out, they're being put out with good intention. And one of the things that makes us humans are goal-orientated species, right?
Absolutely.
And if I have the good intention of, my goal is to help other people succeed. Yeah, we see that in LinkedIn profiles all the time. Yeah, my goal is to help other people. I've probably got that written in mine somewhere as well. So do sense check me on that. If we would probably think, if I can put out this message that allows people to not have to think too hard about the complexities, they'll reach their goal sooner, which makes me feel better and makes them feel better. When we start to add in the ifs, the buts, the cans, the possibles, the maybes, the it depends, the complexities, it's going to take longer to get to the goal. And we don't like that. And that, again, is a psychological skill of learning gratification. And it's something that our grandparents would have told us about years ago. We have got this culture of instant gratification, and I think that works a lot with these social conditions that we're talking about. So like I said, I hope people are putting these things out with the best intentions of wanting to help people improve. But the most seminal studies on psychology for behavior change towards a particular goal tells us it takes a very long time to hack our biology, to hack our cognitive pathways, to change them and to restructure them so that we legitimately think differently and act differently. Takes more than the 90 days that the person right at the top of the podcast that I was talking about. And so I think people like to think that they're doing people a favor by getting rid of the complexity. And I guess for me, the BS comes in that by doing that, you're potentially making it worse.
I wonder if you ever do completely change behavior. I wonder if it's possible to completely change those pathways. I guess it is to a degree, but I wonder if for most people it's a lifetime of intentional effort. I'm not convinced that, again, going back to personality, that an introvert becomes an extrovert, certainly not overnight. If you're an introvert and as you've mentioned earlier, being in the middle there, that, and if we were to use introversion, extroversion dimension, ambiversion, the vast majority of people are ambiverts. I think that's what the science tells us. But if you've got somebody who's quite a strong introvert, then it's very challenging for that person in a role that requires them to be social, to do activities, to engage in sociality, to possibly engage in positive emotion a lot of the time, because that's what extroversion is as well, and a lot of people don't realise that is your degree of feeling positive emotion. I think for most people it's a lifetime of effort. That's just my opinion. There we go, that word opinion. But I wonder if the evidence tells us that as well. I don't think a strong introvert who has a typical introverted response starts to have a typical extroverted response, certainly not within a decade. I wouldn't think within 30 or 40 years. That's just my opinion. I wonder if the evidence is
If we've got any cognitive psychologists listening, please do the work for us and give us the answer. Like, show us the evidence. And I think this is sort of off topic, but it's the consideration of it, isn't it? To what extent is behaviour a manifest of value and personality? If we look at, like offenders, and they go through years and years and years of rehabilitation and come out and don't offend again, and what is it that has changed? Is it their neurological pathways that have changed? Is it their value systems that have changed? Or is it just, I want to say simply, and as you said, that they have learnt to modify their behaviour and put different boundaries of effort around their behaviour to go against what they did before. They might still want to kill someone, but they don't. It's very different to they now don't want to kill someone.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is probably not a topic for now, and I certainly don't want to speak over and above my competence level, and I won't get into criminality, but what I would say is I think that my investigations of, say, personality science, and I've brought personality science a number of times on the Sports Site show, and it's really interesting gauging people's response, because it's not a particularly popular area, but one also has to. Or my understanding is where personality is going is towards this notion of we have characteristic adaptations, whether through a narrative identity, through strategy, through self-interpretations, through objectives or goal orientations. Those things have, personality science is starting to incorporate those things into a hierarchy with the 5 factors at the bottom, coloured, smothered by those characteristic adaptations. And I suppose where we as psychologists start to intervene is helping people create a different narrative, reset objectives and goals, reinterpret events, create or identify values to be able to mediate those 5 traits, those 5 all-important, the structure of personality, essentially. But we're probably going off on a different topic. I think it's interesting. I
agree with everything you just said, and I think it's wonderful, and you put it far more succinctly than I could have done.
No, well, I think it's interesting, and I tell you what, conscious of your time, I do want to briefly nip onto the 4th, although I think we've kind of alluded to some of this throughout the narrative that we've had. But what's that 4th area you'd like to talk a little bit about?
My 4th is just to watch out for constant contradictions. And I think this is where I'm sort of asking the psych community to just check yourself in terms of what you put out and when and how and to whom, and to not be afraid to put the ifs and buts and ands and, it depends. And it's just, I said, a bit of a call to hold ourselves more accountable, because if we've got individuals that are coming to pop psychology, for life inspiration and whatever it is that people need to find, we've got the loads and loads of competing messages that maybe they just confuse me because my brain doesn't like the contradiction. But it's like, you'll have these inspirations of never stop improving, but then you'll always have someone saying, know that you're enough as you are. Well, what do you want me to do? Do you want me to stay as I am because I'm perfect as I am? Or do you want me to constantly keep learning and striving and growing? Like, I can't do both. And then you got what we're saying about, just cut toxic people, get rid of negativity. And then you've got the other mantras of know that everyone's having their own struggle. Well, more than likely, if someone's not being very nice, it's because something not very nice is happening to them. So what are we going to do? We're going to cut that person out, or are we going to embrace them with their struggle and say, okay, let me help? You can't have both, and you've got other ones of always keep progressing, keep moving forward, dare to dream. And then you've got all the other stuff of just be still, be in the moment, be present. Like, they are completely contradicting statements. Be kind, but be a disruptor. Be yourself, but change your mindset. It's just, and it's people different message. And I'm not saying that you've got to choose one and you've got to, stick by that. And I'm sure your listeners can think of lots of other, examples. But it's just, I guess, wanting people to just be a bit more. The people that are putting the posts up, maybe just be a bit transparent about why is it that at that particular moment you're feeling like you just want to be still and you just want to rest. But why is it at another moment that you've chosen to say, I need to progress and I need to move forward? There's nothing wrong with having contradictory thoughts. We're not robots, but when, and this sort of, loops back to the authentic self. When you've got someone that 1 minute is constantly saying, you're enough, you're enough, you're enough, you're enough, and then they go and have a boob job, there's nothing wrong with having a boob job. It's just, they're just all these messages. And I think for me, this is where the pop psych bubble just needs to burst a little bit. Just be transparent about why at that particular moment you feel like being kind and why at that particular moment you feel like you need to challenge. I'm not saying you can't, but
I will go you with my favourite one. It was a couple of pictures on an Instagram feed, and I think those pictures were with 2 or 3 pictures apart, with a motivational tip, which the first one was a picture of people partying, and it kind of said, let others go party, you stay at home and work hard. And then about 3 pictures later it said, I've got to take time off, be with your friends. It's just like, okay, which one would you like me to do? and it's kind of, I think I really kind of feel, listening to you, what you're saying is it's not that they're wrong messages, it's just providing a bit of a rationale that underpins what those messages look like, and how those messages can be combined. And why is there, if you want to go and be an athlete, if you be a 100 meters runner, what does being with your friends look like, and why might you not go to that party? Why might you go to the party and behave in a particular manner and choose what you do and you don't drink? And might you choose to stay at home on another evening? It's just, those are probably pretty obvious answers to those questions, but it's just adding in a couple of more sentences to enlighten people on why they should engage in certain behaviours. And I suppose maybe in social media, maybe Twitter, and maybe, hey, look, I might be guilty of this because I use those platforms to send out messages. I'd like to think I include coulds and possibles, and I've become much more mindful of that. I think that sometimes as a practitioner, when you're passionate about what you do and you're passionate about certain messages, you can be really guilty of being one-dimensional, sending something one-dimensional out there. And I've caught myself certainly recently going, I wish there'd been more nuance to that. sometimes there's just not enough space for nuance.
Mm-hmm.
And you kind of await somebody to come back to you and go, well, isn't there another way of looking at that? And that affords you the opportunity to go, yes, right, it's like this as well. So I think it's an interesting landscape. And I think my final thought on this, I'd like to get your final thought on this, is for me, it does come back to that complexity, whether it's the sugars and glucose being eaten away by thinking about stuff. It's just, which makes things feel hard when you've got to think. It's we can all be scared of complexity, and I suppose that maybe that's where, simplicity sells, or reductionism sells. People might listen to one-dimensional messages first because 2 or 3 dimensional messages are more complex to take on board. Mm-hmm. I just wonder if that's the situation.
I think it's part of it, yes. And I think if you're a coach and you see your athlete posting stuff, or you hear them sort of saying these mantras, we see things like this, like inspirational quotes splattered all around beer and stuff, and there's nothing wrong with the quotes, but it's just what we don't want. The sociologist in me, Foucault's consideration of the docile body. We don't want someone just taking something for granted and not putting their own thought and understanding into why they've decided to think that message is important to them. Ask your athlete or ask your colleague, I'm really interested in the fact that you've said that, or the fact that you're paying attention to that. Help me understand the thought process behind it, because all you want to do is get to know the person better, to understand why is it that they think it's important for them at that particular time. And if they don't, I think if they can't articulate in a passionate way or a related way why they've decided to pay attention to that, then there's nothing wrong with just challenging them on it. But is a whole load of athletes just paying attention to nonsense? And I think there's quite a lot of nonsense out there at the moment.
Well, I think that's well said. I think that's a good place to. We'll finish on Foucault. We'll finish on Foucault, because it will start to go. Things will start going straight over my head in a minute. So it's a good finishing point. This has been absolutely brilliant conversation. And it's a hard conversation. It's a difficult conversation. I respect and appreciate different worldviews and people just saying, look, I'm a performance coach or I'm a motivational coach and I choose to throw out messages that way. I mean, I suppose, Natalie, we live in a free society. If people want to do that, they can do that. Mm-hmm. You're pointing out doing that can be to the detriment of the people they're trying to communicate with.
Yeah, and I sort of as with every area, I don't think there's anything wrong with holding people accountable. Yeah. And I said, just going back right to the start, I think that's really, to say to someone, I think that's really interesting. Help me understand how you got to that point. And if they can't tell you how they got to that point, then maybe pay less attention to it than something else, is my opinion.
Yeah.
And that's all it is, an opinion.
I'm a follower of your social media and with all of your good opinions, and I know other people would like to follow you as well. How can people find you?
So my Twitter is Dr NJ Campbell. I don't do Instagram, and yeah, I mean, if you come to my Twitter at the moment, you'll see pictures of my baby and mostly me just retweeting other people's intelligent stuff, because I no longer have the mental capacity to think too much original content. But I really welcome people asking me questions, check and challenge me when I say something dumb, because we all do it.
Well, I think think the last hour has disproved what you've said. So, no, look, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Natalie. That was awesome. Everyone, that was Dr. Natalie Campbell. I really enjoyed that podcast, and hopefully it got you thinking. And I'd love to hear what you, the listener, thinks. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website to tell me exactly what you think of the Sports Psych Show, and if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. Now, I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.